Welcome to the Rusted Garden Homestead. Today's video is all about a trick that you can do to get tomatoes earlier to your table. Trick in the sense it's a way of thinking about growing tomatoes that we don't normally think about. What we normally think about is just awesome big upper growth, lots of green, big transplant. We put it out into the garden and then it ends up struggling. And there's a couple reasons for that. Then we're going to talk about something that I'm doing right here. This is actually a 10-week-old plant. And these are some plants in small cells, medium cells, large cells. These plants were once this tall. I cut them back about 10 days ago, and I'll explain to you why I did that. And the whole idea is that I'm growing a big root system. So we're going to focus on the plants right here. If you want to see what difference container size makes, I have a video on it. I will link it in the video description, and it actually uses the plants that you see right here when they were, fully grown at 6 or 8 weeks. I cut them back for today's video. But growing in a larger container creates a larger root size. A larger root ball really allows the plant to grow more up top. Pretty much common sense. Everything that you see on the bottom here, all these tomato plants were planted on November 27th. They are 10 weeks old, and you can see the different size. Sticking with that idea, the more room the plants have to grow roots, the more soil, the better the plants get. And you can just see how beautiful that one is. The plants here are actually 8.5 weeks old. They were planted on December 2nd. So, idea number one, the more space you have for roots, the better plant you get, period. And that's true, for just about any kind of plant you're growing. But no matter what size container you have, you don't really want to grow tomato plants past 6 to 8 weeks from putting the seed in the ground, assuming they germinate in about 5 or 7 days. Those plants will get too big. So this, even though this plant looks great, it's starting to flower, it's going to start forming fruit. That plant is getting past its prime, going into its 9th week. So you only need tomato transplants to grow about 6 to 8 weeks from putting the seed in the soil. And then you want to get them outside into soil temperature that's 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18.2 degrees Celsius. That's the top 2-4 inches. And you can figure that out as the days warm into the 60s. You're getting warm rains, the nights are staying in the 50s. Spring is coming on. That top couple inches, that top, 5-10 centimeters of soil is starting to warm up. Tomato plants and peppers, your warm weather crops, really want to go into that 65 degree soil. If you put them into colder soil, even if they have these massive upper green growth, they're just going to struggle. They're not going to do well. One thing that you can do, and I've done this now for a couple of years, is you can grow root systems versus upper growth. This plant again was up to here. I don't know, maybe a week ago or so, 10 days, I cut it back, and I'm just letting it re-sprout, keeping it fed with fertilizer. They're a little bit yellow. I just hit them with a water soluble yesterday to green these up. Now, for this experiment to work, everything here was planted at the same time, cared for the same way. When I cut back the plants in the small cells and medium cells, they just didn't come back. The root systems weren't big enough. So if you're going to do this experiment, you want a larger cell like this. You can make your own with a water bottle. I made these out of foil. I'll link the video for that. You can make little pockets for planting out of foil. It's real easy to do, very inexpensive. So you have a larger cell. These tomatoes were growing about 8-9 weeks. They got really big. I cut them back. I'll explain to you now. I'm going to clear some of this out, and we'll talk about the root systems. What does that mean, and how does that get you a plant that matures more quickly, grows more quickly, produces fruit more quickly? I've been growing tomato plants for a good 30 plus years. The guy right here is 4 weeks old. I put the seed in on, what was the date? On January 7th, and I think today's February 6th. So that's about 4 weeks growth. At 6 weeks, this guy is going to be ready to go outside. You don't need to grow your tomato plants past that point for upper growth. If you get a really big plant, like, this guy's getting to good size, and if it's bigger, you think, oh, wow, that's better. I put this little root ball outside into the ground. Also, real quick side note, If you're growing stuff indoors, you have to slowly acclimate your plants to the outdoor sun over a 7-day period. They have to get used to the UV rays of the sun, or the sun's actually going to burn and damage them. So part of the time of growing indoors is a week period of acclimating the plants to the sun, the wind, temperature changes, and stuff like that. So if this, transplant already has been in there too long, it's at 10 weeks or so, it's growing flowers, you don't want that. It's not going to be a healthy transplant. All the energy from the roots is going to go to the tomatoes right here. The plant's going to be smaller, small root ball. I get this out on May 1st into the right soil. You got all this upper green growth, sun hits it, transpiration occurs, water, evaporates out in the whole process, and it only has this little tiny root ball to gather water. Not a big fat garden where you have water everywhere, but just this root ball. So this plant is going to struggle until the root system grows big enough to support the upper growth that you grew indoors, that you gave it a cushy life, lots of water, lots of food. Once the root system gets big enough, this plant will take off again, although it's going to be kind of hampered by growing tomatoes at such a small stage. So this is really not a healthy transplant. We're going to cut this back. I'm going to show you how to do it so it looks like this, and then it'll get this new green growth. So in the small cells, medium cells, large cells, have a video on these plants when they were looking good at 8 weeks, and it talks about why cell size matters. Go ahead and watch that. Also sell these at my seed shop. So once I cut these back, the root systems weren't strong enough, and they've all pretty much died out. There's no nice whiteness there. The root system's here, the soil just broke, nothing holding it together. With the larger cells, you get larger root systems, and this is going to get potted up into a larger container. Let me grab it. And I'm going to let this finish out for another 4 weeks, get a bigger root system, and maybe put it into another pot after that. Then it will go outside. I'm basically going to be planting a root plug with a little bit of upper growth. It's going to stay looking like this, stay alive. When that root system gets into my garden, 65-degree temperatures, top couple of inches, 18.2 degrees Celsius, that root system is going to be ready to support massive growth up here, and it's just going to send out all these shoots and take off. The root system's already established. It takes longer for the roots to grow and establish and support growth than it does for the upper green to take off and really get going. I hope that makes sense. So this experiment's really about growing a really nice root system. Kind of counterintuitive, because we're used to wanting these massive upper growths of tomatoes, which, they look beautiful, but when you have a tiny root ball and you put it into the garden, the plant suffers. So I encourage you guys to experiment. Try something like this. You don't have to start in these containers. You can start in a bigger container, just let the plant go, and when it gets to 8 weeks, cut it back. When it gets a little bit bigger, cut it back. The plants here are going to probably have, a good 16 weeks worth of root growth before they go into my garden. Let's recap how you would do this experiment. You want to start your tomatoes in a larger cell, something like this. You can make a little foil pocket, start in a water bottle, anything that allows for more root growth. After, from putting the seed in the soil, assuming it germinates in about 5 days, 7 days, in about 8 weeks, you want to cut the tomato plant down like this. Keep it in its original pot, and in about 7 or 10 days, it's going to get this new growth. So that's at about 8 weeks, we cut it back. 9, 10 weeks, it gets the new growth, and then we're going to pot it up into a larger container. And you just pop out the plant, loosen up the root ball. Oh, that's a little bit too much in there. And then we're going to just drop in the tomato plant like that. There's no fertilizers in the starting mix. Every tomato that you see in this video was treated and cared for the same exact way. Tuck in the soil, and then you're going to want to feed this at least once a week with a diluted water-soluble fertilizer. That's going to allow this plant to continue to grow a nice big root system. When it gets maybe this wide or something, you're going to cut it back again. And we're really growing this. If we're targeting a date, let's say May 1st is the perfect time to get your tomatoes into the ground, we would count May 1st, go back 4 weeks, April 1st, 4 weeks, March 1st, 4 more weeks, February 1st. So all in all, you're going to want about 12 to 14 weeks growing like this. So around February, let me make sure I got it right, February 1st, I would start this process to get a really nice root system. And then 12 weeks in or so, this would go out into the garden. I might trim it back a little bit more, and subscribe and follow me. I'll show you how well these plants do. They did really well last year. Get it into the ground, water it in nicely with a water-soluble fertilizer, and just really let it go. And I know it sounds counterintuitive if I'm using that word right. You know, typically, and I've been talking about this for years too, is that you want a nice big transplant to go out into the garden. When I would grow larger transplants, back in the day when I did plant sales, they would go into cups that were 8 and 10 ounces, 12 ounces. So there's more soil in there. So they worked pretty well. To recap, if you're growing tomatoes indoors, 6 or 8 weeks, whatever type of cell you're growing in, get them outside into the garden. If you want to go past 8 weeks and grow a really big root system for, 12 weeks, 14 weeks, this is how you would do it. And I would encourage you to give it a try. Don't just take my word for it. So this plant has been growing, again, probably 10 weeks. They went into the ground on November 27th, something like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave 1 joint, 2 joints, and maybe a 3rd joint out of the joint. And you can see already in there, leaves are coming up. Well, there's a joint there that I plucked off some leaves because they were dying. Let me get that in focus. And you can see new leaves are starting already. You can also see all these bumps on here. Those are root nodes. And because a tomato plant is a vine, whenever an area stays moist or humid, touches the ground, these new nodes come out and they grow roots. It wants to flop over, fall over, and kind of trail on the ground. So and what's kind of cool about plants is they have specialized cells that can differentiate at different points throughout the plant based on what the plant needs. So we're going to be able to just have all these leaves start popping out. So we're going to cut it right here. We're getting rid of all of this, seems harsh. The flowers, we don't want those. And then I'm just going to cut the leaves that are there off until we end up with something that looks like this. And I'm going to pot this up too. You don't have to at this point because I cut the leaves back. The roots are going to use the nutrients. That's why you have to feed them at least once a week with a water-soluble fertilizer. Make sure the nitrogen stays in there because in order for the plant to grow all these leaves back, it's going to need a lot of nutrients. And the number one nutrient that it needs is nitrogen. So we could pot this up into the bigger container now. These are all red beefsteaks, and I'm going to have one section of my garden this year of just root transplants, is what I like to call them, tomato root transplants. And you can see, let me keep the camera there for a second. This is all that I cut off of that tomato plant. You just don't need it. And then to do it again for this guy, we would cut off here, 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 here. Let's see. I'm going to cut off this whole piece. And then the leaves right there. And then you end up with something like this. And that is going to perpetuate root growth. It's going to want to send up new leaves. You know that it's doing well. It's already sending up a nice green one right there. And we can grow a beautiful tomato root transplant and get it into the garden. Now these guys are beautiful. I'm going to cut those back too. And actually, let me cut in before I do that. We can identify tomato suckers, which are just production vines. This is a sucker. Right where the leaf comes out and the main stem keeps going up, you're going to get sucker growth, which are perfectly fine. They're going to produce flowers. They're going to produce fruit. We just remove them to limit the size of the plant. You can grow in a tray like this. This is just 2 inches deep, 5 centimeters deep, baking tray, and you can grow tomatoes that way. And then you would, have a massive root system. They could go into the ground, all that. But in theory, I can just break this off, put this into water, it will root out, and now I will have a tomato transplant in about 6 weeks. It could go into the ground. And again, the leaf comes out, the main stem goes up, and right in there is the sucker. That's going to turn into a production stem. So I don't want that in there right now. All right, let me cut these back, and please subscribe. I'll show you how well these plants do, but I'll teach you how to grow food, start all kinds of different things indoors, get them outdoors, direct seed outdoors, take care of pests and disease, you know, the whole 9 yards. This is just one way to grow tomato transplants, and I recommend experiment. It's really, really effective. Now, 6 or 8 weeks, indoors, right into the ground, perfect. If you want to grow beyond that 8 weeks, that 12 weeks, 14 weeks, develop a big root system. This is how I would do it. I'll call this the TRG method of growing root tomato transplants. You can see what's left now, just basically the stem, couple leaves coming in the joints in different places, like right up here. That's perfect. Removed all of this. And again, the theory is that if you have a really big tomato transplant, or even one that's smaller, but a tiny little root ball, you put it into the ground, all it has is that little root ball to pull in water. So when the sun hits it, it's a nice warm day, 70 degrees, you've got, you know, an abnormally small root ball, lots of upper green growth, that plant is going to suffer dehydration. So water that plant every day until it's well established with the root system. That plant's going to kind of sit and wait until the roots get large enough to support more upper growth. What we're doing here is removing the upper growth while we're growing the transplants, growing large root systems, getting it into the ground, giving it a big drink of a water-soluble fertilizer. The roots are massive enough already to support great growth up top, and that tomato plant is going to accelerate its growth, its development, and it's going to bring tomatoes more quickly to your table. And don't take my word for it. Experiment. Give this a try. You'll, I think, be really surprised on how well that tomato plant does. Thanks so much for watching. Please check out my seed shop at therustedgarden.com. All tomato and pepper plants are $1.75 a pack, and all the other seeds there are only $1.50 a pack. Again, thanks so much for watching.